In this video, I'm going to try something new. I'm going to use a Microsoft Word document in the hopes that I can use it as if I would a whiteboard. Why not? It's just a white piece of paper. The goals for this particular video are to demonstrate three major sentence level errors that occur in student writing and how to avoid them, obviously. I'm going to show you how to fix those errors. And in addition, I'm going to introduce something called sentence variety, which is something you should aim for in your essays. In fact, in all your writing moving forward. So we're going to get started with, and I've already cheated this a little bit, I've already prepped some things. We're going to start with a fundamental building block that I think it's important to understand, and that is a clause. Now, clauses and phrases make up sentences oftentimes, and a clause by definition is very basically a group of words that work together that has a subject and a verb. The reason I have words working together, in other words, they're not just random words scrambled about, you're not just digging into a hat and picking out words, they actually are trying to work together. And they have a subject and a verb, but a clause isn't necessarily a sentence. Now, there are two main types of clauses, even though there are a lot of types of clauses. I'm going to cover two of them today. One of those is independent clause. And what that means is it's a group of words that have a subject and a verb, because that's what a clause is, but that particular group could stand alone as a sentence. The other type is called a dependent clause, and that too has a subject and a verb, but it could not stand alone as a sentence. And what all of this begs, since the word sentence is in the definition, it begs what a sentence is. So I have the definition of a sentence. A sentence will have a subject, a verb, and it will express a complete thought. If we're missing any one of those elements, we end up with what's called a fragment, and that is the first of the three major sentence level errors. And you're going to notice that all the sentence level errors in this video are highlighted in red. So fragment, a group of words punctuated like a sentence, but is missing one of the three items above. I suppose it could be missing more than one, but that would be tough to do. And I'll be honest with you, for the most part, students tend to leave out number 3, which is the express a complete thought. And when I say tend to, I mean that is if you write fragments in the first place. Quite frankly, out of the three major errors, fragments are the least occurring. At least they're the least ones I see in essays. And whether you use Microsoft Word, Google Docs, or Grammarly or something like that, I'm thinking they do a pretty good job of catching these things. So let me give you an example of a fragment. Although I woke up late. It has a verb, woke, and to find the subject of a sentence, you ask who or what, and then read from the verb on. So I would say, who woke up late? The answer is I. So we have a subject and we have a verb. The problem is this does not express a complete thought. If someone just walked up to you and said, although I woke up late, you'd probably be wondering what was next, where the rest of the sentence was. The good news is the easy way to fix a fragment, once you recognize that you have a fragment, is to find what's missing and then complete that. So if I were to complete this sentence, and I hope the typing doesn't make too much noise here. Although I woke up late, I still made it to class on time. And now you get to see how I make errors and I misspell things all the time. Although I woke up late, I still made it to class on time. Now I have a complete thought. It expresses a complete thought, and now I have a full sentence. And I just want to point out something to you, that if I were to delete this part, I still have a complete sentence. Made it is my verb. Who still made it to class? I did. So I have a subject and a verb, and that does express a complete thought. If someone walked up to you and said, I still made it to class on time, I think you'd have an understanding that they made it to class on time. So for now, you can always pause the video and look at this, but for now I'm going to delete this part on fragments just so that we can have that independent and dependent clause close by. Although I suppose I should do one other thing. I should point out to you that in this first part right here, although I woke up late, we already established that it has a subject and a verb, and it doesn't express a complete thought, and yet this one has a subject and verb and does express a complete thought. That means that this part right here is an independent clause, and I color-coded it to match right up here, and this part is a dependent clause. And I'm going to color code that as well to match the dependent clause up there. And you can already start to see that we are heading to this part of the lesson, which is introducing sentence variety. When we mix up clauses, dependent and independent, in certain ways, we can have nice sentence variety. But I'm going to get to that in a few minutes. I just wanted to point out, though, that if you have a dependent clause punctuated like a sentence like we first did, that results in a fragment. But if you have an independent clause punctuated as a sentence, it's a perfectly good sentence. Now I'll get rid of that and move on to the next part. Here I'm just going to insert what looks like a sentence, but this sentence has a problem. If I look at it, I can see my first verb is had, or had darkened, and I could ask what had darkened. The answer is the clouds, so that makes that my subject. So I have a subject and a verb, and I would argue that this is a complete thought. The clouds had darkened. That is a complete thought. So that means that that is an independent clause, which also means that it could stand alone as a sentence. So I'm going to highlight that blue. I have another verb over here. We're out. What we're still out? The boats. I have a subject. I have a verb. And again, I would argue that this expresses a complete thought. So this also is an independent clause. So I'm going to highlight that blue as well. What I have here are two independent clauses joined without punctuation. And that brings us to the second sentence level error that occurs, and that's called a run-on. Now, some of you may have been taught that a run-on is a sentence that goes on, or it's a sentence that's too long. I think both of those definitions are awful. Really what a run-on is two or more independent clauses. I'm going to highlight that blue as well, just because that's what we're dealing with, is independent clauses joined without punctuation. So to show you this, we're going to move this up here. This right here that's been bracketed is an independent clause. I'm going to copy that and paste it. I'm going to try to copy that and paste it. I'm going to fail miserably, apparently. And indeed, I did fail miserably. We have both of these are independent clauses, and it's joined without punctuation. The good news is there are 4 different ways to fix this. I'm going to scroll down here just a bit. And here are the 4 ways. I'm going to walk through each one of them. But let me do one more thing here. Let me just throw that sentence in there again, make it easier to work with. Here we go. So if I look down at add a period, I could just simply add a period right here, make the next sentence a capital T. Now I have 2 simple sentences. The clouds had darkened, the boats were still out, and this is now grammatically correct. So that is solution number 1, add a period. If I go with solution number 2, I could simply add a semicolon. That no longer is uppercase, but that becomes lowercase, and a semicolon is used to join 2 independent clauses. However, you should make sure that the 2 clauses are closely related to each other, if not showing some kind of cause and effect, that they are closely related. I wouldn't want to see 2 discrete, non-connected, independent clauses joined with a semicolon. The semicolon actually means they belong together. My other take on semicolon is you can live a long, fulfilling life without ever using the semicolon. I think it's overused these days, but it's perfectly viable to use. Just don't go overboard in your essay. So that was number 2. Number 3, we could simply add a comma and add one of the coordinating conjunctions. In this case, we have fanboys. They're the coordinating conjunctions. You may have learned them this way, and that's an acronym, FANBOYS, fanboys, and they represent for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. These are the only coordinating conjunctions. And the best way to think of coordinated conjunctions is like an equal sign in math. What's on one side grammatically is on the other side as well. And you can see that here we have the independent clause, the boats were still out, and on the other side of that equal sign, we have another independent clause. So consider fanboys as equal signs. And that's another way to create a sentence and to fix the run-on that we had. The last way is one that I like to see because it shows really some nice, I guess, skill, some writing skills. So it's to make one a dependent clause. So let's go ahead and take that word we did before with the fragment and just use although. Although the clouds had darkened, the boats were still out. And what you're going to notice here, and I'm going to color code this accordingly, is that I've now created a dependent clause. Notice that it has a subject. It still has a subject, clouds. It still has the verb had darkened, but it can no longer stand alone as its own sentence. If someone walked up to you and said, although the clouds had darkened, you'd probably be lost. Oops, I got to get rid of that. Yet my second part is still an independent clause. Although the clouds had darkened, comma, the boats were still out. This is a perfectly legitimate way to write a sentence. And there's a bonus comma rule thrown in here. Whenever you have a dependent clause or that precedes an independent clause, there'll be a comma separating them. Now note, I could make the second one a dependent clause instead. So let me go ahead and do that. Let me go back to the clouds had darkened. And let me convert that back to blue since now we're dealing with an independent clause once again. I'm going to get rid of the comma. Even though, and I need to convert this now because now this has magically turned into a dependent clause. So here we have the clouds had darkened even though the boats were still out. Again, this is a perfectly good sentence. It starts with an independent clause and is followed by a dependent clause. And notice that when the independent clause precedes the dependent clause, I no longer need a comma. So that's a run-on and how to fix it. And in addition, I'm showing really how to have sentence variety, which makes me want to jump down here and put in this same sentence once again as soon as I find it. Here we go. Some of you, your instinct may have been to simply insert a comma here. And the problem with that is that creates our last major error. And that is what's called a comma splice. And I give you the definition right here. A comma splice is when we have two independent clauses joined only with a comma. Now, a comma splice is considered a type of run-on. So if it's a type of run-on, you can imagine that the best way to fix it is to do something very, very similar here. And indeed, that's what we have here. How to fix a comma splice. You do the same thing, only on number 3 there's a slight variation. We no longer have to add a comma because the comma is already there. Instead, we're just going to add the fanboy, much like we've already done. Comma splices are probably the most frequent sentence level error I see in student writing. And it doesn't seem like the end of the world. You know that there's a pause there of some kind, so you instinctively throw a comma in there. However, it is a little abuse of the comma, so if I start commenting on comma splices in your essays, here's the thing you need to do. Cover up everything to the right of the first comma and ask yourself if what's on the left can stand alone as a sentence. If the answer is no, you're fine. Move on to the next comma in your paper. If the answer is yes, this part could stand alone, well, then you should cover up this part and see if the right-hand side could stand alone as a sentence. Again, if the answer is no, you're probably okay. But if the answer is yes, well, you have a comma splice because you have two independent clauses joined only with a comma. And that sums up the 3 sentence level errors that usually derail students' writing from time to time. And it's something that if you can clarify and correct before your essay gets graded, it seems to enhance the essays considerably. I'm sure if you were listening closely, you probably heard a little Boston accent slip in, so I might as well just do another one here. Here we have an independent clause. The car was parked by the bar. And here we have another one, but the patrons weren't there. So this one is actually done correctly, though, because I have addressed number 3 right here, which is add a comma and a coordinated conjunction between the two. So this now is a perfectly good sentence. This leads to the next part of this video, which is really just going to show you sentence combining. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on this a little bit. The different sentences that you can create while you write and this is just a small sampling, are pattern 1, which is coordination. And if you notice with this one, we have the fanboys. It spells out fanboys, F-A-N-B-O-Y-S. And that's the one where you have 2 independent clauses joined with a comma and a fanboy. So that's one of the ones we just went over. Here's another one where we have a semicolon between 2 independent clauses. But in this case, we've also added a word called a conjunctive adverb. It's not necessary that you remember what that word is, but there are words like furthermore, however, in fact, and nevertheless, as you can read here. So in this case, we still have a semicolon after the first independent clause. Then we have the word followed by a comma. Again, make sure that the 2 independent clauses are closely related. If I scroll down, pattern 3, this is called subordination. And in this case, we have an independent clause, and then we have a dependent clause that starts with one of these words. Much like I did before, the example I did before was even though, and even though that's not listed here, it still works, right? One becomes a dependent clause. And then the final pattern, pattern 4, starts with a dependent clause. So although I was late to work, comma, and then followed by an independent clause. So for your first essay, what I would like you to do, don't worry about sentence structure as you're writing your child's draft or just writing your first draft. Just write your essay. But before you submit it to me, what I'd like you to do is try to find at least one sentence for each of these patterns. And if you don't have one, try to create one and then highlight that. So I'll have 4 highlighted sentences in your essay. And I'll make a deal with you. If you've highlighted these 4 sentences, I'm not going to mark you down if you do it incorrectly. This is an opportunity to learn and practice with sentence variety. And I think it's good to be able to have that freedom to truly practice and try to get it right. And as you become more familiar with these different sentence types, I think you'll find that it's going to enhance your writing considerably. Just please don't highlight your entire essay so that you cover yourself for any grammatical errors. All I want is 4 sentences. And that sums up the sentence level errors, how to fix them, and how to have sentence variety in your writing.